The dog didn't bark when she walked in. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not her credentials, not the worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, not the way she moved through the gate like she already knew every inch of that compound. It was the silence from Kodiak, 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois, who had put 3 handlers in the infirmary in the past 6 weeks, that stopped every conversation dead in the training yard. Nobody said a word. Chief Warrant Officer Darragh Kells was the first to find his voice. Who called the vet? He wasn't really asking. He said it the way men like him say things, loud enough for everyone to hear, soft enough to deny later. A few of the guys laughed. Someone muttered something under their breath. The woman didn't slow her pace. She crossed the gravel yard toward the far kennel block with her eyes straight ahead, and Kodiak, who was pacing the chain link with his teeth showing, stopped, just stopped, pressed his nose to the fence and waited. Her name was Renata Solis, 28 years old, civilian contractor, and the paperwork that had arrived at Petawawa 2 hours earlier said she was there to conduct an assessment of the unit's working dog program. Nobody at CFB Petawawa had any idea what to do with that. The base was running on tension that week. It had been that way since the incident, since Master Corporal J. Ferris had gone down on a training exercise outside of Trenton, and Kodiak had come back to the kennel alone, dragging his harness, with nobody able to explain what had happened between the point where Jay went ahead to clear the ravine and the point where the dog reappeared 40 minutes later without him. Jay had survived. Barely. He was in a hospital in Ottawa with a broken femur, a fractured collarbone, and a concussion that left him unable to tell anyone anything coherent about that night. Kodiak had been behaviorally compromised ever since. That was the official language. Behaviorally compromised. It meant the dog had tried to take apart every person who went near him. It meant 2 experienced handlers from the Integrated Police and Military K9 unit out of Kingston had driven 4 hours, spent 40 minutes trying to get within 10 feet of Kodiak, and driven 4 hours home. It meant Sergeant Vera Lundy, the most decorated animal trainer in the regiment, a woman who had worked with protection dogs for 16 years, had recommended in writing that Kodiak be removed from active service and assessed for euthanasia. The recommendation was sitting on Major Brennan Harker's desk when Renata Solis arrived. Major Hark hadn't signed it yet. He told himself it was because he was busy. The truth was that something about signing it felt wrong in a way he couldn't name, and he'd been a soldier long enough to know that when something felt wrong without a clear reason, you waited. He'd made some calls. Someone had given him a name, and now there was a 28-year-old woman with a canvas bag and no visible body armor walking toward the most dangerous dog on the base. "Someone should probably stop her," said Corporal Andris Zale, watching from the other side of the yard. Nobody moved. What the unit knew about Renata Solis was almost nothing. What they could see was a woman of medium height with dark hair pulled back in a serviceable knot, wearing cargo pants and a long-sleeved shirt despite the August heat. She carried herself with the kind of stillness that most people don't learn. The kind that either comes from years of working in environments where sudden movement gets you hurt, or from a nervous system wired differently from the start. What they didn't know, what most people didn't know, because she had never made a point of advertising it, was that Renata had been working with military working dogs for 7 years, that she had started at 17, volunteering at a civilian handler training facility in Abbotsford, British Columbia, washing kennels and hauling water buckets, and sitting quietly outside enclosures for hours at a time until the dogs decided she wasn't a threat. That by 21 she had her certifications, that by 23 she was being called in by RCMP detachments across Western Canada to assess dogs that other handlers had written off, that by 25 she had worked with animals that had come back from active overseas deployments in states so dissociated they could barely be approached, and had brought most of them back. She'd never done any of that to get noticed. She'd done it because she understood something about dogs that most people who worked with them professionally seemed to miss, or maybe had decided was inconvenient, that a dog who had formed a real attachment to a handler didn't stop being that dog when the handler disappeared. The attachment didn't break. It waited, and a dog, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back, looked from the outside like a dog that had gone wrong. She'd seen it enough times to recognize it the moment she read the file on Kodiak. She recognized it again now, standing 10 feet from the chain link, watching him watch her. "You're going to want to stand back," Darakel said, materializing at her shoulder. He'd crossed the yard without making it obvious he was following her. He was good at that, moving like he had every reason to be wherever he was. "That dog has put people in hospital." "I read the reports," Renata said. "Then you know he's not safe." She was quiet for a moment, not ignoring him, just not answering yet. "What was his handler's name?" she said. Kells blinked. "Ferris. J. Ferris. How long had they been together?" 4 years, give or take." She nodded. Her eyes hadn't left Kodiak. The dog was still pressed against the fence, watching her with an intensity that was different from the aggression the reports described. It wasn't a threat display. It was something else. 4 years, she said, and Jay's been gone 6 weeks. I don't see what that has to do with. 6 weeks, she repeated. And in that time, how many people have come in here and tried to force compliance? Kells didn't answer. The Kingston team used a bite sleeve and a long line, she said. It wasn't a question. Standard pressure response protocol. Sergeant Lundy tried counter-conditioning. How many sessions before she wrote him off? 3 sessions in 6 weeks. Renata finally turned to look at Kells. He was a big man, mid-40s, the kind of physically imposing that came from a lifetime of deliberate maintenance. He was looking at her the way men like him sometimes looked at people they'd already decided didn't belong. "Do you know what that dog has been through in the last 6 weeks?" His partner disappeared. Then strangers started showing up and trying to control him with equipment and pressure he didn't understand. In a context where he was already terrified, every session you ran was teaching him that the world after Jay is something to fight. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when something true gets said in a room full of people who weren't expecting it. "He's not broken," Renata said. "He's grieving." Kells looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kodiak, who was still pressed against the fence, his nose working the air in Renata's direction. "You got 2 minutes," Kells said, "and I'm pulling you out the second he escalates." "He won't escalate," Renata said. "Not with me." Kells crossed his arms. "You're pretty sure of yourself for someone who's never met that dog." She didn't argue. She turned back to the fence. She didn't open the gate. That surprised everyone who was watching, and by now most of the yard was watching. Men doing a very convincing impression of being busy with other things, while their attention was entirely somewhere else. They expected her to push in, to try to establish herself in the space. That's what handlers did. You entered, you claimed the environment, you showed the dog that you were in charge of the situation. Renata sat down on the ground, not near the gate, not in a position of advantage. She sat cross-legged about 6 feet from the chain-link fence, put her canvas bag down beside her, and took out a small, battered notebook. She opened it and appeared to start writing. Kodiak watched her. She didn't look at him. She wrote in her notebook. At some point she reached into her bag without looking and took out a piece of something, nobody could see what, and set it on the gravel beside her knee. Then she kept writing. 4 minutes passed. Kodiak stopped pacing. 6 minutes, he lowered his head, still watching her, still not making a sound. 8 minutes, he lay down on his side of the fence. Corporal Zale, who had moved closer without realizing it, heard Kells exhale beside him. "What the hell is she doing?" Zale said very quietly. "Absolutely nothing," Kells said. "As far as I can tell, and it's working." Nobody answered that. After 15 minutes, Renata put the notebook away. She picked up the piece of food from beside her knee and held it out, flat-palmed, toward the fence. She still didn't look directly at Kodiak. She looked at a point somewhere to his left. Kodiak got up. He moved to the fence with his head low and his tail still, and very carefully took the food through the chain link. Then he sat down 2 feet from her and waited. She reached into her bag again and came up with a second piece. She held it the same way. He took it the same way. The third piece she held slightly closer to the fence. He had to press his nose through the link to reach it. His head was inches from her hand. The fourth piece she held in her palm with the fence between them, and when Kodiak took it this time, she very gently, without looking, laid 2 fingers along the side of his jaw. He didn't flinch. He didn't snap. He stood there with her fingers against his face and his whole body still, breathing. Renata looked at him then. Just looked. And something in his posture changed. A drop in the tension across his shoulders, the smallest forward lean, like a person who's been holding themselves together, finally allowing themselves to let go. Dara Kells had seen a lot in 22 years of service. He had been in places that still showed up in his dreams. He thought he had a reasonably complete picture of what was possible in the world. He revised that picture, standing in a gravel training yard in Petawawa on a Wednesday afternoon in August, watching a dog that had terrorized 6 experienced handlers press his forehead against a chain-link fence and lean into the hand of a woman who had known him for 18 minutes. She didn't go in that day. She came back the next morning at 6:30, before the rest of the unit was fully operational, and sat outside the kennel for 40 minutes with her notebook and her small pieces of food and her sideways glances. She came back at noon. She came back at 4. Nobody assigned her a schedule. Nobody asked her to. She just appeared. On the 3rd day, she went in. Kells was there. He'd told himself he wasn't making a point of being there, that he happened to be in that part of the compound. He'd stopped believing that around day 2. He positioned himself at the gate with a long line in his hand, a precaution he told himself, and watched Renata unlatch the kennel door and step inside. Kodiak was already on his feet, standing very still in the center of the enclosure. She didn't rush. She came in, latched the gate behind her without turning her back on the dog, and crouched down. Not all the way, just a lowering of her center of gravity, a reduction of her height. She held out her hand. Kodiak crossed the enclosure in 4 strides and put his head in her hands. Behind Kells, someone said something low and profane that was not, in context, an insult. It was the sound of a person watching something they didn't have words for. Renata stayed in the enclosure for 20 minutes. She didn't run commands. She didn't test him. She just moved around the space and let him follow her, and crouched occasionally, and scratched behind his ears, and spoke to him in a voice too low for anyone outside to catch. When she came out, she walked directly to Kells. "He's ready to work," she said. Kells looked past her at Kodiak, who had sat down in the center of the enclosure and was watching the gate with what could only be described as patience. "That's—" He stopped. 6 weeks without his person, Renata said, and 6 weeks of people trying to control him by force. You trained that anxiety into him. Every session added to it. He needed someone to stop pushing and just be present. Kells was quiet for a moment. "So what do we do now?" he said. "Carefully," she said. "You do it very carefully. It didn't go smoothly. Nothing real ever does." The first handler Renata selected to begin transition work was a younger corporal named Seth Bork, 26, quiet, patient in the specific way of people who grew up around animals. She'd watched the unit for 3 days before picking him. Seth had a stillness that reminded her of Jay Ferris, based on what she'd pieced together from the records, and she thought Kodiak might tolerate that similarity. She was right, but barely. The first session lasted 4 minutes before Kodiak decided Seth was not yet a known quantity, and made his position on that very clear. Nobody got hurt. Renata called it before it escalated, but Seth came out of the enclosure looking a little pale, and Kells came over and put a hand briefly on his shoulder and said nothing, which was, in the culture of that particular unit, the equivalent of a speech. "He's not ready for a handler yet." said Warrant Officer Ingrid Talbot, who had appeared at some point in the last 20 minutes and was watching with her arms folded. Talbot ran the unit's training program and had been professionally courteous to Renata since her arrival, which meant she'd said hello and not much else. "I don't think it's fair to put more of my people in that enclosure." "He's not ready for pressure," Renata said. "That's different, with respect." Talbot said, "I don't see the distinction. The distinction is that Kodiak knows exactly what he's supposed to do. He hasn't forgotten his training. He hasn't lost his drive. He's lost his confidence in the people around him, because the people around him stopped being trustworthy when Jay disappeared and then kept showing up to fight him." Renata looked at her evenly. "He doesn't need a new handler yet. He needs to learn that the world contains people he can trust again. Seth is doing the right thing. He just needs time." Talbot looked at Renata for a long moment. "How much time?" she said. "As long as it takes." Talbot turned away without answering. Kells, who was standing slightly behind and to the left of Talbot, caught Renata's eye for just a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not agreement exactly, acknowledgement. The second session with Seth went better. The third went better than that. By the fifth, Kodiak was taking commands from Seth, not smoothly, not without hesitation, but taking them. Renata stood outside the enclosure and watched, and made herself not react, and did not allow herself to feel relieved, because relief meant expectation, and expectation was exactly the thing that had gotten the Kingston team into trouble. By the end of the second week, Kodiak was running basic search patterns with Seth in the yard. By the end of the third week, he was running them on the full training course. Kells found Renata standing outside the observation post on a Thursday afternoon, watching Seth and Kodiak work the far end of the course. The dog moved like he'd been rebuilt from scratch, completely focused, completely committed, completely Kodiak. "I owe you an apology," Kells said. She glanced at him. "First day," he said. "The comment I made. Who called the vet?" He looked at the course. "It wasn't appropriate." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "The thing is," he said, "we see animals come back changed. It happens. And usually changed means he's stopped. Usually it means the animal is done. It means you push to get them stable, you retire them, you move on. We had a dog named Atlas. Came back from a deployment overseas and just wasn't Atlas anymore. 3 handlers, 6 months, nothing. We had to let him go." He paused. "I assumed Kodiak was Atlas. Every dog is different," Renata said. "Yeah." He watched Kodiak work for a moment. He had a training nickname, you know, when he was a pup. Before Jay formally partnered with him, the trainers called him Ghost because he could clear a room without making a sound. He looked at her. Jay was the one who started calling him Kodiak, said he needed a name with some weight to it. Renata didn't say anything for a moment. "Jay picked the right dog," she said. "Yeah," Kells said again. "He did." Jay Ferris came back to Petawawa on a Friday in late September. He was walking with a cane that he'd been told was temporary and that he was already treating as optional, swinging it more than leaning on it. His collarbone had healed ahead of schedule. The concussion symptoms had mostly resolved. He looked like a man who had come back from somewhere and was still sorting out what to make of having done so. Major Hark met him at the gate. Talbot was there. Kells was there. Most of the unit was somewhere in the vicinity, arranged in the casual non-formation that military people who want to see something but don't want to make it obvious about themselves tend to adopt. Renata was at the kennel. She'd been preparing for this for a week. She'd told Seth, who understood without being told everything she meant by it, and Seth had spent the last 3 sessions walking with Kodiak on the long line around the outer perimeter of the base in the early mornings, gradually extending the range, letting the dog relearn what it felt like to move through open space with a person he trusted. Not to hand him back in worse shape than she'd built him. She heard them before she saw them. The clank of the gate, boots on gravel, then Jay Ferris's voice, still a little rough. saying something about how the place hadn't changed, and Kodiak heard it. The change was immediate. The dog went rigid, not in a threat posture, not in the aggressive stillness that had characterized his first 6 weeks, but in the specific, arrested way of an animal that has heard something the rest of its nervous system hasn't caught up with yet. His head swung toward the sound, his whole body oriented. Renata moved to the latch. "Slow," she said, not to anyone in particular. To herself, maybe, to the situation. "Slow." She opened the gate. Kodiak walked through it at first. Just walked, contained, looking. And then Jay Ferris cleared the corner of the kennel block and the dog's whole body broke open in a way that had nothing to do with training. Jay went down on one knee, bad leg and all, before Kodiak reached him. He put his arms around 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois and held on, and Kodiak pressed his whole face into Jay's shoulder and made a sound that wasn't quite a bark, and wasn't quite a cry, and wasn't really anything that had a good word attached to it. Nobody said anything. Talbot looked at the ground. Kells looked at the sky. Corporal Zale, who was 23 and had been on the base for 8 months, and had never seen anything like this, and wouldn't again for a long time, made a sound of his own that he would later claim was allergies, and that everyone who heard it would pretend, out of kindness, to believe. Jay looked up over Kodiak's shoulder and found Renata standing by the kennel gate. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. There wasn't a lot more to say than that. She drove out on a Saturday. The paperwork was done. The transition was documented. Seth Bork had been formally designated as Kodiak's secondary handler, a role that Joey had been consulted on and had endorsed, and the rehabilitation plan was written up in a report that Renata had spent the better part of a week ensuring was specific enough to be useful and not so dense that no one would read it. Major Hark shook her hand at the main gate and told her the unit was grateful, and she said that was good to hear, and he laughed a little at her deflection and didn't push further. Kells was there too. He'd told himself, again, that he happened to be near the gate. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked. "Winnipeg," she said. "Next week. There's a shepherd mix at an RCMP training facility who's been flagged for early retirement. They think she's too reactive." Kells looked at her. "You think she's not?" he said. "I think she probably just hasn't found the right voice yet," Renata said. She shouldered her canvas bag and walked to her truck. A battered 4Runner with a crate in the back and a collection of dog-eared field manuals on the passenger seat. And Kells stood at the gate and watched her go. The drive out of Petawawa took her through the tree line and then the flat stretch of highway north, and the sky was doing the thing it does in September in Ontario, all gold and grey at once, and she put the window down and let the air in. In the canvas bag on the seat beside her, next to the notebook that she'd had since Abbotsford, and that was nearly full now, there was a photograph that Jay Ferris had pressed into her hands the night before. He looked embarrassed giving it to her, but he did it anyway. It was Kodiak at about 14 months, long before deployment, long before Petawawa, long before any of it, just a young dog in tall grass, looking at something off camera with his ears at full attention and his whole body coiled with energy. She hadn't asked what he was looking at. She didn't need to. She knew that look. She'd seen it 100 times, the look of an animal who hears something far away and turns toward it, and waits, patient and certain and completely sure, for whatever is coming to arrive. Some things, she had learned a long time ago, just needed someone to keep the faith while they found their way back.